Welcome to StickMan Explains.
We often hear jokes about Americans struggling with geography or placing historical figures like Napoleon somewhere between professional wrestling and Pedro Pascal. But how much do we truly know about U.S. history? Do you still think the space race was a unified national endeavor, Prohibition was pure madness, and cowboys wiped out all Native Americans? Then settle in, friends. This is our traditional segment on myths and historical accuracy. Let's start with Alaska. The story of its purchase has taken on a Hollywood-esque narrative. Supposedly, the U.S. initially resisted buying it, but the deal was eventually pushed through with much struggle, only for gold and oil to be discovered later, leading to widespread happiness. Then Secretary of State William Henry Seward was dubbed an unsung genius who foresaw everything, overcoming resistance to secure a profitable territory that has since paid for itself hundreds of times over. In reality, the opposite is true. The decision to purchase Alaska was supported by 37 out of 39 officials in the Senate. The overwhelming majority of government representatives, businesses, and ordinary citizens supported expanding U.S. territory. The only sticking point was allocating the funding. This was indeed debated for nearly a year, but the debate wasn't about whether to buy it or not, but rather from which budget line item the money should be drawn. At the time, no one considered the acquisition of Alaska to be unprofitable. Similarly, the Russian Empire wasn't run by idiots who simply gave away what is now one of the wealthiest regions of the U.S. for a pittance. The Russian Empire was successfully developing Alaska and trading furs there. They would have continued to do so if not for one crucial factor. The Great Game was unfolding between Britain and Russia, a struggle for dominance where the two empires constantly hindered each other. Alaska, located directly adjacent to British Canada, could have become another such point of contention. After the Crimean War, only an idiot wouldn't have anticipated that Britain might exert pressure on Russia's overseas territories, especially since the 19th century Great Game primarily focused on Central Asia. Thus, a logical solution emerged. The Russian Empire decided to divest itself of a hypothetically problematic asset in Alaska. This simultaneously freed them from bordering Britain and strengthened the U.S., a nation the empire had assisted since the War of Independence. The myth of lost wealth emerged later when the U.S. began actively developing Alaska. However, it's not a given that the Russian Empire wouldn't have lost Alaska anyway. And from another perspective, strengthening the U.S. strategically against Britain was in many ways also achieved. But those are the intricacies of the Great Game. Returning to the U.S., let's briefly touch on another story involving public approval. Here, the situation is reversed, and we're talking about the space race, where supposedly the entire country, in a unified surge of effort, competed with the USSR to send a person first into space and then to the moon. The reality, unfortunately, is more modest. The space race reached its peak public approval rating in 1969, immediately after the moon landing, and the figure was only 51%. Literally all other times, the majority of Americans opposed spending on space and such efforts to compete with the USSR. And as for territories, there are myths in history beyond Alaska. The popular perception has solidified an image of the U.S. constantly expanding its territories since its founding. And now they're even eyeing Greenland. However, the process of decolonization affected not only the British Empire and France. The U.S., for example, lost the Philippines in 1946, a territory it had controlled for half a century. This was a region then inhabited by about 20 million people. And the area of the Philippines, for a moment, is larger than Italy. Today, it's a country with 100 million people and a growing GDP comparable to Argentina's. The U.S. acquired the Philippines after the Spanish-American War of 1898. In 1946, they nominally ceded the territory for the sake of democracy. In reality, of course, things were more complex. It wasn't just about the popularity of the decolonization movement at the time. The US was no stranger to going against the majority of countries on the planet. The issue lay with US agricultural corporations that couldn't compete with cheap Filipino products, and also with the Filipino people themselves, who fiercely fought for independence. Thus, economic and social reasons converged. The US also lost Cuba, which it had annexed, along with territories of the Panama Canal, Micronesia, Palau, the Marshall Islands, and other areas. In total, if you add it all up, we're talking about a large European country with a population almost a third of today's states. The reasons varied, and in some places, there's still room for irredentism. But we probably won't delve into that topic. Let's head to the Wild West. In those good old days, cowboys robbed banks between duels, defended against Native American ambushes, and wore funny hats. Well, at least that's what everyone thinks. In reality, from 1859 to 1900, across all 15 states collectively known as the Wild West, there were exactly 10 bank robberies committed. And that's on the high end. Historian Larry Schweikert doesn't even count that many. Today, any neighborhood in New York City sees that many robberies in a month. Also, there's no credible historical evidence of even a single classic Hollywood-style pistol duel taking place, where cowboys stand opposite each other and fire simultaneously. Only Wild Bill Hickok shot Davis Tutt on July 21, 1865, in a somewhat similar manner, and even then, there were nuances. Both cowboys, by the way, wore ordinary bowler hats. A typical Wild West shootout was chaotic, involved many people, and lacked any rules. And they weren't actually that frequent. But perhaps the saddest page in the history of the Wild West is about Native Americans. Somehow, through cinema and literature, the myth of a conflict between cowboys and Native Americans permeated society. And the problem here is that along with this myth and films starring Johnny Depp, the idea also seeped into society that the conflict was, in some sense, fair. Cowboys and Native Americans fought. Both wanted to exterminate each other. Cowboys won, so it's fair, right? Unfortunately, no. Because cowboys and Native Americans met extremely rarely. In the 20 years from 1840 to 1860, Native Americans killed 362 migrants, of whom, at best, 1 in 5 were cowboys. For comparison, in just one county in New Jersey during the same 20 years, 77 deaths were recorded from falling off horses. And that's just one county with, at best, tens of thousands of people, compared to 15 states of the so-called Wild West. Because cowboys actually feared Native Americans, and they, in turn, surprisingly often preferred to trade rather than achieve their goals through attacks. And the extermination of Native Americans was not a romantic, head-on confrontation with equal chances. Unfortunately, it was a cynical, meticulously planned, and prolonged operation. Forced relocation to reservations, military campaigns, economic pressure, assimilation, and other grim realities reduced the Native American population. It was certainly not romantic cowboys winning an open conflict. The reasons for introducing Prohibition in the US are also usually described romantically. It was announced with the 18th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920. And so it began. Al Capone's, bootleggers, the flourishing of the mafia, and only an increase in per capita alcohol consumption. And the Great Depression, the casually informed observer often includes in this equation. Admit it, something in your head just clicks about the absurdity of it all. But surely the authorities weren't so foolish as not to foresee the consequences one step ahead? Why then was the ban introduced in the first place, and why was it lifted so late, only in 1933? The answer to the first question begins with the fact that Prohibition in the US did not forbid the consumption of alcohol. It forbade its production, storage, and transportation. Long before the announcement, citizens were informed that they could buy as much alcohol as they wanted, and then calmly drink it and offer it to friends. It was also permitted to produce up to 800 liters of wine or cider per year at home. Plus, there were escape routes even for those who weren't stockpiling. Firstly, from 1921 to 1930, doctors in the US earned $40 million solely from whiskey prescriptions. Yes, doctors then prescribed alcohol for nerves, depression, and other ailments. Secondly, production and consumption for religious purposes were also allowed. And here, something in your head has probably clicked again. Intuitively, you want to say that many people only turn to the church to drink. And that is indeed true. The production of sacramental wine doubled in a matter of years, as did the number of congregants. And this brings us squarely to one of the reasons for Prohibition. Yes, Protestants and other churches advocated for Prohibition and wielded immense influence in the US. For example, in just one small community, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, by 1919, boasted 1/3 members. And that's just one community. The church condemned alcohol consumption, and the possibility of ritual consumption was intended to attract congregants. And from there, as they say, we'll re-educate them. But this is actually a lesser reason. World War I had a much greater impact. Firstly, during the conflict, the US promoted sobriety as a way to support the war effort, because grain was simply confiscated from alcohol producers and sent to feed soldiers. Social advertising was also organized around this, portraying famous German beer as an enemy product with all the implications. Pressure on immigrant bars, where all this was sold, began according to the same scheme. So, when World War I ended, it was somehow inconvenient to break a line already approved by society. And, of course, business got involved. John D. Rockefeller, one of the wealthiest men in the US, funded countless temperance societies so that sober workers would increase productivity. Henry Ford followed suit and introduced Prohibition in all his factories in 1914. The Anti-Saloon League, funded by magnates, by 1919 had enough resources to even nominate its own presidential candidate. So the government's decision to both maintain the social line and not alienate magnates is understandable. And frankly, Prohibition in the US cannot be called an outright failure across the board. The consumption of pure alcohol dropped from 10 liters per year to 3, and even with the black market, to 6. Consequently, the number of deaths related to alcoholism decreased, and labor productivity, as the magnates wished, increased. However, there was a catch. Only 3,000 employees were assigned to monitor the 120 million strong US population, and they, of course, couldn't cope with anything. Hence the mafia, lawlessness, and bootleggers. Because of them, Prohibition eventually had to be repealed. And also because of the Great Depression, of course. If in the Roaring '20s the US could afford to get rid of 1 million jobs in the alcohol industry, in the Great Depression, not so much. But there is still no direct connection between the two widely known events in US history. The Great Depression is a separate topic with a separate video on our channel. Well, we'll finish with Vietnam. There's no getting around it in US history. But here, another Hollywood myth constantly peddles the story of how the anti-war movement in the US almost attacked veterans. Rambo, Forrest Gump, and a host of other films exaggerate the contradictions. In reality, historian Jerry Lemke, in his book, The Spitting Image, examines hundreds of alleged testimonies and finds no evidence. He concludes that this entire story was initially fabricated to discredit the anti-war movement. That's probably all for us. What country's myths would you like to see in future episodes? Let us know in the comments.